Introduction. There are moments when a city stops being a place people live in and becomes a force that insists on being changed. London in the summer of 1858 was one of those moments. For weeks, the air hung heavy and sour over the low river plain where the Thames runs through the heart of the metropolis. The smell was not just unpleasant, it was accusatory. It clung to coats and hair, seeped beneath doors, crawled up through drains and chimneys, and settled into the minds of everyone who could not escape it. Men and women found themselves breathing an odor that carried with it a story of waste and water, of crowded rooms and overflowing privies, of a city that had simply outgrown the way it disposed of its own life. That odor would come to be called the Great Stink. It was not a single smell, but a layered one. Human refuse mingled with animal blood, tannery effluent, factory dyestuffs, and all the organic decay that a growing industrial capital produced. It rose from the river like a visible fog, rolling into streets, into the stone-lined courts of Parliament, into the high rooms where decisions were meant to be made. In that heat, the Thames no longer flowed like a cleansing artery. It had become a black, shimmering conveyor of everything London would not see. And when the stench reached the seat of power, the city found a way to force itself toward a solution. Development London was Victorian modernity at its most extreme: booming population, booming trade, and a municipal infrastructure that lagged years behind. Houses were built over cesspits. Many streets relied on cesspools emptied by nightmen, human waste carted away in the dark. Where cesspits were full or absent, chamber pots and drains simply spilled into gutters and into the shallow tidal river. The river that had sustained the city for centuries became the repository for its filth. At high tide, the effluent pressed back into the streets. At low tide, the exposed riverbed looked like a black marsh, its surface flecked with scum and debris, its banks dotted with piles of rotten refuse. On hot days, the air above it was thick with the smell of fermentation and death. Public health was a science still wrestling with itself. For much of the early 19th century, the dominant explanation for disease was miasma, the idea that noxious airs carried sickness. The smell of the Thames was therefore not just offensive, it was presumed dangerous on principle. Yet another, subtler understanding was gaining ground. By 1854, a London doctor named John Snow had drawn a map and followed death to a single public water pump in Soho. He showed, with careful observation and patient collection of evidence, that cholera was carried in water. His work did not immediately overturn orthodoxies, but it was precise. It named the river and its tributaries as agents of transmission, not merely as metaphors for moral contamination. Cholera was already a familiar terror. Recurrent epidemics had thinned the city's population, killing the young and old, the poor and sometimes the middle classes, in alarming numbers. The disease moved with the movements of water and people, with poor sanitation, with crowded lodging houses, with the communal wells and shared pumps that were the lifeblood of working neighborhoods. Yet every attempt to legislate or to build change seemed to run into political caution, private property, cost, and the inertia of institutional practice. Local boards and ad hoc cleaning efforts tried to keep pace with expanding filth, but London's scale overwhelmed them. Then the summer came that did not wash away. A hot, dry spell allowed the full, putrid breath of the Thames to make itself unmistakable. The river, baking in the heat, gave off a continual, rancid odor that spread across the city. The smell invaded the Palace of Westminster. Lawmakers found it difficult to sit and deliberate. Debates slowed and then stopped. Important documents became stained with the same dark inevitability as the water outside. There are stories, repeated so often they become part of the myth, of MPs retreating, of windows being slammed shut in desperation, of the administration fumbling with chemical sprays and makeshift remedies. Whether true in every detail, The core is a simple and stubborn truth. The stench made governing impossible. Into that moment stepped an engineer named Joseph Bazalgette. He had been working on smaller drainage schemes and had sketched out larger ideas before the crisis. But the Great Stink concentrated political will in a way that ordinary statistics and pamphlets had not. The urgency was now visible, tactile, and immediate. Bazalgette proposed a bold, practical intervention. Do not only move sewage away from the city, intercept it, direct it, and treat it. Build large, continuous sewers that would catch the waste before it could reach the river through the small, failing conduits and cesspits of individual neighborhoods. Use gravity where possible, and where it was not, use steam pumping to lift the flow. Push effluent downstream to treatment outfalls beyond the urban center, and in doing so, transform mudflats into new embankments and roads that could be the face of a modern city. It was a civil engineering solution, but it had political, social, and human consequences. Parliament granted the necessary powers. Laborers, many of them immigrants and rural migrants, set to work with shovels, bricks, and sweat. The project reshaped the river. Massive interceptor sewers were tunneled and lined. The Thames embankment reclaimed land from the water and hid the new sewers beneath grand promenades and carriageways. Ornate pumping stations rose where the tide and topography required mechanical assistance. Their ironwork and brick were sometimes almost cathedral-like in craftsmanship, a strange, dignified architecture for the machinery of waste. Bazalgette and his team built not a quick remedy, but a durable system. They anticipated growth, using larger dimensions than immediately necessary, not from hubris but from common sense. The pipes and tunnels were meant to outlast a single generation and to carry more than a single city's present refuse. When the sewers began to function, the change was not instant, but it was profound. The visible filth near the city center receded. The smell that had once been a constant companion lifted. Waterborne diseases declined where clean water and effective sewage conveyance became consistent. The new infrastructure was less dramatic than a single heroic cure. It was the patient, persistent work of directing flow and refusing to let waste simply continue as before. Reflection. We like to tell stories about sudden revolutions, decisive battles won or lost in a single day. The Great Stink complicates that narrative. It was neither a single event nor merely the triumph of a scientific breakthrough. It was a convergence of elements: an environmental crisis, an old public health debate, the relentless arithmetic of urban growth, and the engineering mind that could imagine how to reroute a city's refuse into new channels. It took smell, immediate, public, undeniably offensive, to translate the threat into political action. The smell was the language that power could not ignore. That is worth pausing on. Smell is the most primitive of senses. It bypasses theory and speaks directly to survival. In this case, it provided the moral and bodily pressure that statistics and counsel could not. The consequence was infrastructural, a new understanding that cities must manage not only their streets and their markets, but also the invisible flows beneath them. The schemes built after the Great Stink set standards that cities across the industrializing world would follow. Sanitation became not a matter of charity, but of civic design. Clean water and reliable sewage systems would, over decades and across continents, prevent illnesses that had once killed millions. There is also a quieter lesson. The systems that keep us alive are rarely glamorous. They are pipes and tunnels and pumps, hidden beneath pavement and riverbanks. They are decisions made by committees, calculations rendered in brick and mortar, and the labor of thousands whose names we do not know. When they fail, we smell it. When they work, we rarely notice. Modern public health is less about sudden miracles and more about the accumulation of small, technical choices stitched together into networks. The Great Stink forced that stitching to happen in London sooner than it might otherwise have. but everywhere the work of sanitation is ongoing. Pipes age, storm patterns change, populations grow. The visible signs may change. Promenades replace mudflats, steam engines give way to electric pumps, but the imperative remains the same: to manage the flows that sustain city life. And finally, there is an ethical dimension. The very thing that prompted action, the smell that reached Parliament, also reminds us that urgency often follows visibility. For many Londoners, the danger had been present for years. For those who lived closest to the river, the daily cost was real. It took the odor reaching the chambers of power to catalyze a response. That truth invites reflection in our era about who feels the immediate pressure of environmental and public health crises, and who only responds when the consequences become impossible to ignore. The Great Stink sits in history as a turning point where a metropolis learned to treat its waste as something to design around rather than hide. It is a story of a smell that saved a city, not by some magical reversal, but by forcing people to see the problem the way it really was and to build the durable, patient infrastructure that a modern life requires. We live today with the legacy of that summer: cleaner water, fewer epidemics, streets that do not smell of decay. We also carry its teaching forward, a reminder that sometimes it takes the most ordinary senses to teach us the most extraordinary lessons about care, foresight, and the quiet engineering of a livable future. The Thames still runs, quieter now, but the memory of that hot, unbearable season remains a kind of warning. When a city stops managing its flows, the consequences are not merely aesthetic, they are moral and mortal. And when enough people can no longer breathe freely, the city will change, or it will not survive.